The room went silent the moment the white CEO reached for the young waitress's name tag and said, "People in uniforms should learn to stay invisible." The words settled over the private dining room like a sudden winter frost, freezing every conversation before another fork could touch another plate. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished walnut walls, but none of that warmth reached Naomi Brooks. She stood perfectly still beside the table, balancing a silver tray with practiced hands that refused to shake. The embroidered navy blue uniform she wore looked immaculate, pressed before dawn like every shift she had worked during the past 4 years. Her smile never disappeared, even as several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances and quietly looked away. The harbor room inside the prestigious Ashford Grand Hotel hosted only the city's most influential people. Governors closed deals there. Fortune 500 executives celebrated acquisitions there. Investors measured fortunes over perfectly grilled steaks and aged wine. Tonight belonged to Ethan Caldwell, founder and CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, whose latest merger promised to reshape an entire industry. Reporters waited outside the hotel entrance. Cameras flashed every few seconds beyond the tinted windows. Everyone inside understood that tonight's dinner mattered. Everyone except, apparently, the waitress standing beside the table. Ethan barely looked at Naomi before speaking again. "I asked for sparkling water 5 minutes ago." His voice remained calm, but every syllable carried the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Naomi gently placed the bottle beside his glass. "My apologies, sir. The kitchen requested a fresh bottle because the previous one wasn't chilled to the proper temperature." Ethan glanced briefly at the label before giving a dismissive smile. "Interesting. You seem to have an answer for everything." A few guests laughed politely, more from obligation than amusement. Naomi simply nodded. "Only when I believe the guest deserves the best service." Her response contained neither sarcasm nor resentment. It was sincere, almost disarming. That sincerity irritated Ethan more than defiance would have. He believed people revealed themselves through appearance. Expensive suits reflected discipline. Tailored jackets suggested ambition. Uniforms represented limitation. It was a philosophy that had guided every hiring decision he had ever made. Across the table, one board member quietly studied Naomi for an extra second. Something about her composure seemed unusual. She moved through the room with remarkable awareness, anticipating every request before it was spoken, noticing details others ignored. When one executive accidentally nudged a leather portfolio toward the edge of the table, Naomi caught it before it slipped to the floor without interrupting another conversation. She apologized as though saving expensive documents were somehow her mistake. Ethan noticed the movement, but dismissed it as routine hospitality. As the first course ended, hotel staff began clearing the table while lawyers prepared folders containing the merger documents scheduled for signature after dessert. Naomi gathered empty plates one by one until a single folder caught her attention. It had been left slightly open beside Ethan's chair. She never intended to read it. She simply reached to straighten the leather cover before lifting another plate. Then one sentence near the top of the exposed page stopped her cold. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly before she immediately looked away. She finished collecting the dishes exactly as she had been trained, her expression calm, her footsteps measured, but inside, something had shifted. Hidden among the ordinary legal language was a detail she recognized instantly. And if she was right, the celebrated CEO, who had judged her by nothing more than her uniform, was only minutes away from making the biggest mistake of his career. Naomi carried the tray through the service hallway with the same steady pace she used every night, but her mind refused to slow down. The sentence she had glimpsed inside the folder replayed itself again and again, every legal phrase fitting together like pieces of a puzzle she wished she had never seen. Steam drifted from the kitchen line where chefs called out orders over the hiss of cast-iron pans, while servers rushed past carrying perfectly plated filet mignon and roasted asparagus. The familiar rhythm of the restaurant usually settled her thoughts. Tonight it only sharpened them. "Naomi, table 12 needs fresh bread." Her supervisor called without looking up from the reservation list. "Right away," she answered softly, placing the empty tray onto a stainless steel counter before reaching for a basket lined with white linen. No one watching her would have guessed anything had changed. That was one of the first lessons her mother had taught her years ago. Never let panic speak louder than your character. Even when life surprised you, finish the job in front of you before worrying about the next one. It was advice Naomi had followed through college, through family hardships, and through every shift she worked after putting her own career on hold. Most people inside the Ashford Grand believed she had always been a waitress. None of them knew she had once spent long evenings studying financial reports instead of restaurant menus. None of them knew she could recognize the structure of a merger agreement almost as quickly as she could memorize the evening specials. Years earlier, she had imagined herself sitting inside conference rooms instead of serving coffee outside them. Then her mother's diagnosis had changed everything. Medical appointments replaced interviews. Hospital waiting rooms replaced graduate seminars. Savings disappeared one invoice at a time. When her mother passed away 2 years later, the professional opportunities Naomi had once chased had already slipped beyond reach. Employers noticed the employment gap before they noticed her credentials. Interviews became polite rejections. Bills continued arriving. The Ashford Grand offered dependable hours, health insurance, and enough income to keep her apartment. She accepted the uniform with gratitude rather than resentment because surviving with dignity mattered more than protecting her pride. Across the kitchen, another server smiled as she passed. "You okay? You've been quiet tonight." Naomi returned the smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" Naomi hesitated for half a second before answering. "About how one decision can change everything." The other waitress laughed lightly without understanding and hurried away with another order. Naomi wished she could laugh just as easily. Instead, she carried the bread toward the private dining room, each step feeling heavier than the last. Through the partially open doors, she heard confident voices discussing quarterly growth projections, acquisition targets, and shareholder confidence. Numbers floated through the room as casually as dinner conversation. Ethan Caldwell sounded relaxed now, his earlier impatience already forgotten. He thanked an investor for joining the partnership and assured everyone that the legal review had been exhaustive. "We've covered every possible risk," he said with complete certainty. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. She knew confidence could become dangerous when it stopped asking questions. As she placed the warm bread onto the table, her eyes remained respectfully lowered, yet she noticed the leather folder had been moved beside Ethan's chair once again. This time it lay completely closed, waiting for signatures after dessert. She told herself to walk away. She reminded herself that she was only a waitress and that speaking could cost the only stable job she had left. But another memory surfaced, one from a professor who had once looked across a crowded classroom and said that integrity meant telling the truth even when silence was easier. Naomi quietly stepped back from the table, but before she reached the doorway, one sentence from the executives stopped her in place. "We'll sign the final agreement in exactly 15 minutes. Naomi remained beside the doorway for one long breath, the warm basket now empty in her hands while conversations continued as if the next 15 minutes carried no consequence beyond another corporate celebration. She could hear the quiet confidence around the table, the familiar rhythm of executives who believed every variable had already been calculated. Crystal glasses reflected the amber light overhead. Expensive watches caught tiny flashes beneath the chandelier, and leather folders rested neatly. Before every guest, everything projected certainty. Only Naomi saw the invisible crack beneath the polished surface. She turned toward the service corridor, determined to keep walking. It wasn't her meeting. It wasn't her company. It certainly wasn't her place. Yet every step away from the dining room felt heavier than the last. She reached the employee station and slowly set the empty basket onto the counter. Nearby, one of the younger servers was rolling silverware into crisp linen napkins while humming quietly to herself. "Dessert is up in 3 minutes," the pastry chef called. "Private room first." Naomi acknowledged him with a nod, but barely heard the words. Instead, she remembered another room years earlier, one filled with whiteboards covered in balance sheets instead of dinner menus. Professor Harold Whitmore had stood before his graduate finance class holding a merger agreement almost identical in thickness to the one Ethan Caldwell was about to sign. He had smiled before asking a simple question. "Where do bad contracts usually hide?" Students had immediately searched the largest financial figures, ownership percentages, and revenue projections. The professor had shaken his head. "Never underestimate the footnotes." The biggest lies are almost always written in the smallest confidence. Naomi had never forgotten that lesson. She graduated near the top of her class because she noticed details others rushed past. During internship simulations, she had uncovered hidden liabilities buried beneath routine language. Her professors praised her patience more than her intelligence because they believed patience created better judgment. Those years suddenly felt both distant and painfully close. She looked down at her own hands. Tonight they carried serving trays instead of financial reports, but they were still the same hands that had learned to recognize dangerous wording before signatures turned mistakes into disasters. A quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. Naomi. She turned to find Margaret Ellis, the hotel's senior concierge, standing beside the hallway entrance. Margaret had worked at the Ashford Grand for nearly 3 decades and possessed the calm presence of someone who understood people better than policies. You look troubled, Margaret said gently. Naomi hesitated before answering. Have you ever known something important but wished you didn't? Margaret smiled with quiet understanding. More times than I can count. Naomi glanced toward the private dining room. What if speaking creates a bigger problem? Margaret followed her gaze without asking unnecessary questions. Sometimes silence creates the bigger one. Those words settled into Naomi's thoughts more deeply than Margaret could have realized. Before either woman spoke again, the hotel's event coordinator hurried into the hallway carrying another leather portfolio. Final signature copies, he announced proudly to no one in particular. The attorneys finished the revisions 15 minutes ago. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. Revisions. If the clause she had glimpsed remained unchanged after legal review, then no one had recognized what it truly meant. She watched the coordinator disappear into the private dining room. Moments later, applause echoed softly as dessert plates arrived and champagne bottles were opened. Ethan stood to thank everyone for their partnership, speaking with effortless confidence about the future they were building together. At the far end of the room, the attorneys began distributing fountain pens beside every signature page. Naomi drew one slow breath. Knowing she had reached the last possible moment to decide whether she would remain only a waitress in everyone else's eyes or risk everything by revealing the truth she could no longer ignore. I'm sorry, sir, but if you sign that agreement now, you'll be accepting a risk your own legal team hasn't seen. Naomi's voice was calm, neither loud nor hesitant, yet every conversation inside the private dining room stopped as if someone had quietly switched off the sound of the entire building. The soft clink of silverware faded. The waiter carrying coffee froze beside the entrance. Even the pianist in the lounge beyond the closed doors seemed impossibly distant. Ethan Caldwell slowly lowered the fountain pen he had just uncapped and turned toward the young waitress standing a respectful distance from the table. His expression revealed more annoyance than surprise. Excuse me, he asked, each word carefully measured. Naomi swallowed once before continuing. I apologize for interrupting, sir. I know this isn't my place, but I believe there's a provision inside the merger agreement that transfers far more liability to Caldwell Dynamics than your team intends. A few executives exchanged puzzled glances before one attorney gave a quiet laugh. This is highly inappropriate, he muttered, closing his folder with visible irritation. Another investor leaned back in his chair, studying Naomi with cautious curiosity instead of immediate dismissal. Ethan's eyes narrowed. You're a waitress. His tone remained controlled, but every syllable carried unmistakable disbelief. You serve dinner. My legal department spent months reviewing these contracts. Naomi nodded respectfully. I'm aware of that, sir. Then explain why you think you understand this document better than attorneys who have practiced corporate law for decades. She did not react to the challenge. Instead, she answered with the same composure she had used all evening. Because I recognized one sentence that doesn't match the rest of the agreement. The room remained perfectly still. Ethan folded his hands together. Interesting. And when exactly did you become qualified to analyze merger contracts? Naomi hesitated only briefly. Years ago. The response seemed to irritate him even more. Years ago is not a qualification. One of the lawyers smiled confidently. Mr. Caldwell, perhaps security should escort her back to the restaurant floor so we can continue. Ethan never looked away from Naomi. Perhaps they should. Naomi felt dozens of eyes fixed upon her, yet the pressure only reminded her of every presentation she had survived in graduate school, every case study defended before professors who challenged every assumption. She took one slow breath. Before anyone asks me to leave, may I ask one question? Ethan crossed his arms. You already have. Did your attorneys compare Section 8.4 with the indemnification language in Appendix C after the final revisions? The attorney nearest Ethan immediately answered. Of course we did. Naomi looked directly at the closed folder instead of the attorney. Then why does Appendix C redefine operational responsibility while Section 8.4 still references the previous ownership structure? Silence followed. The attorney's confident expression faltered for barely a second before he forced another smile. That's standard drafting language. Naomi gently shook her head. No, sir. Not after the amendment described on page 42. Those two sections now contradict each other. Ethan's fingers slowly released the pen. Several executives instinctively reopened their folders. One investor quietly flipped through the pages. Another attorney reached for the appendix with a puzzled expression. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier began giving way to something less comfortable. Curiosity. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. How would you even know where to look? Naomi remained standing in her navy blue uniform, hands folded neatly before her, offering no trace of pride or defiance. Because that's exactly where I would hide the liability if I wanted everyone to miss it. The room fell silent once more as every attorney simultaneously turned to the same page. The sound of turning pages spread slowly around the table, replacing the easy confidence that had filled the room only moments before. Every attorney now searched the same section Naomi had mentioned, fingers moving through the thick contract with growing urgency. Ethan Caldwell remained seated, his expression unreadable, though the fountain pen still rested untouched beside his hand. He glanced toward his chief legal counsel. Well, the attorney adjusted his glasses and scanned the document again. The language appears consistent at first glance. Naomi said nothing. She understood that complicated contracts often rewarded speed until they punished it. Another lawyer leaned closer, comparing two separate pages side by side. His confident posture gradually stiffened. Wait, he murmured almost to himself. Appendix C references the revised ownership allocation. He flipped back several pages. But, Section 8.4. The sentence never finished. Across the table, one investor quietly reached for his reading glasses while another lowered his coffee cup without taking a sip. Ethan noticed every subtle movement. Speak plainly, he instructed. The senior attorney cleared his throat. There may be a drafting inconsistency. Naomi answered gently before anyone else could. It isn't just inconsistent. Once both sections are interpreted together, Caldwell Dynamics becomes responsible for operational claims that should remain with the acquired company. A long silence followed. The attorney immediately objected. That interpretation would never survive arbitration. Naomi respectfully nodded. Perhaps not, but it would survive years of litigation first. Even if you eventually win, the legal costs, shareholder reaction, and market uncertainty could damage the company before a final ruling ever arrives. No one laughed this time. Ethan leaned forward and slowly opened the folder again. His eyes moved carefully across the paragraphs Naomi had identified. He wasn't a lawyer, but he had negotiated enough acquisitions to recognize when experienced professionals suddenly stopped pretending to have immediate answers. One younger associate quietly whispered something to the senior counsel, who immediately requested another printed copy from the assistants standing along the wall. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Celebration gave way to investigation. One of the investors finally broke the silence. How did she even notice this? Another executive answered before anyone else could. Apparently because the rest of us didn't. Ethan looked back toward Naomi. For the first time that evening, he truly examined her instead of her uniform. She stood with remarkable composure, neither triumphant nor defensive, simply waiting. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only concern. That unsettled him more than confidence would have. Did someone show you this agreement? He asked. No, sir. Did anyone from our competitors ask you to interrupt this meeting? No, sir. Then why take this risk? Naomi hesitated before speaking quietly. Because if I stayed silent after, recognizing it, I wouldn't be able to live with the consequences. The answer lingered longer than anyone expected. Across the room, The chief legal counsel suddenly stopped reading. He slowly looked up, then exchanged a troubled glance with the second attorney. Without speaking, he slid the document across the table. The second lawyer studied the same passage for several seconds before exhaling softly. "She's right about the conflict," he admitted. The amendment created an unintended transfer of liability. Nobody moved. The investor nearest Ethan leaned back in disbelief. Another quietly closed his folder altogether. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, not in anger but in realization. The room that had applauded his certainty less than 10 minutes earlier had become a room full of professionals confronting an expensive oversight. Yet one question refused to leave his mind. He slowly raised his eyes toward Naomi once again. "A waitress doesn't analyze merger agreements like this," he said quietly. "So who are you really?" The question lingered in the air long after Ethan Caldwell spoke it, yet Naomi did not rush to answer. Outside the tall windows, the city lights shimmered across the river, softened by a light spring drizzle that blurred the skyline into ribbons of gold and silver. Inside the private dining room, no one reached for dessert anymore. Coffee cooled untouched beside expensive leather portfolios. The celebration had quietly dissolved into reflection. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking. "I'm the same person I was when I walked into this room tonight, sir." Ethan waited. "I'm simply wearing a different uniform than the one you expected." Her words carried no accusation. They sounded almost gentle, making them even harder to dismiss. One executive slowly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Another stared at the contract instead of the waitress, as though embarrassed by how easily appearances had shaped everyone's assumptions. The chief legal counsel finally closed the agreement. "We need additional review before any signatures are made," he admitted. "I recommend postponing execution until every amendment is verified." Nobody argued. The recommendation that would have seemed impossible 20 minutes earlier now sounded like the only responsible decision. Ethan remained silent, studying Naomi with a completely different expression than before. He remembered every word he had spoken when she first approached the table. People in uniforms should stay invisible. The sentence echoed back with an uncomfortable weight he had never intended to carry. He had spent years building a reputation for recognizing talent. Yet tonight he had almost ignored the one person who protected his company simply because she happened to be serving dinner instead of wearing an expensive suit. Naomi noticed his silence, but offered no satisfaction. She quietly collected an empty coffee cup from the corner of the table and placed it onto her tray with the same care she had shown all evening. Her professionalism had never changed. Only everyone else's perception had. As she turned toward the doorway, one elderly investor unexpectedly spoke. "Young lady." Naomi stopped. "Yes, sir. You could have stayed quiet." "I could have. No one would have blamed you." She smiled softly. "Maybe not, but I would have blamed myself." The investor nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "Character is expensive these days." Naomi offered a polite smile before continuing toward the exit. She had almost reached the hallway when a hurried voice called from behind. "Wait." It was one of the hotel employees from the banquet staff. A maintenance technician had slipped while carrying equipment near the service entrance, scattering tools across the polished marble floor. Before anyone else reacted, Naomi carefully set down her tray and walked over to help. She knelt beside the embarrassed employee, gathering papers that had slid beneath a nearby table and reassuring him that accidents happen to everyone. She never looked toward the executives watching from the dining room. She wasn't performing for them. She was simply being herself. Ethan watched every quiet movement through the open doorway. There was no audience in the service corridor, no business advantage, no opportunity for recognition. Yet Naomi treated the maintenance worker with the same respect she had shown every guest in the restaurant. Something shifted inside him. For the first time that evening, he realized the most remarkable thing about her wasn't the contract she had understood. It was that kindness seemed completely independent of who happened to be watching. Several minutes later, the maintenance employee thanked her before returning to work, and Naomi picked up her tray once more as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Back inside the dining room, Ethan slowly reached for the legal folder again. Tucked inside the front pocket was a small printed resume that one of the attorneys had quietly requested from hotel management after hearing Naomi's name. Ethan unfolded the single page, and as his eyes reached the education section, his expression changed completely. Ethan read the resume once, then immediately read it again, convinced he had misunderstood something important. The page was simple, almost understated, with no unnecessary design or exaggerated accomplishments. At the top was the name Naomi Brooks. Beneath it appeared a master's degree in finance from Northwestern University, graduating with honors. Below that were 2 internships at respected investment firms, followed by several academic awards recognizing excellence in corporate risk analysis and contract evaluation. Then came an abrupt gap in employment spanning nearly 4 years. At the bottom, under recent experience, only one position appeared. Ashford Grand Hotel, Dining Services. Ethan slowly lowered the page without speaking. Nothing on it fit the assumptions he had made within seconds of seeing her uniform. "Is this accurate?" he quietly asked the hotel's general manager, who had entered after hearing the meeting had been delayed. "Yes," the manager replied. Naomi never volunteered any of it during hiring. Human Resources only verified her education because company policy required background confirmation. Ethan looked up. Why would someone with these qualifications be serving tables? The manager hesitated. "She never discusses personal matters, but I know she stepped away from her career plans to care for her mother through a long illness. Afterward, finding a position wasn't as simple as people imagine. She accepted honest work instead of waiting for perfect circumstances." The explanation settled heavily across the room. No one commented. Several executives quietly looked toward the open doorway where Naomi had disappeared moments earlier. They had spent the evening discussing leadership, judgment, and strategic thinking while overlooking someone who possessed all 3 qualities simply because she carried a serving tray instead of a briefcase. Ethan stared once more at the resume before closing his eyes briefly. He remembered the exact moment he had reached for her name tag. He remembered telling her that people in uniforms should remain invisible. Those words now sounded painfully small compared to the dignity she had shown in every response. One of the investors finally broke the silence. "She never mentioned any of this when she spoke." The general manager nodded. "That's Naomi. She believes credentials should explain work, not people." Across the hall, Naomi quietly finished reorganizing the service station. She replaced polished glasses, folded fresh linen napkins, and helped another server prepare the room for the following reservation. The evening continued because restaurants never paused for personal revelations. Margaret Ellis approached with a warm expression. "Word travels quickly in this building." Naomi offered a small smile. "I was hoping it wouldn't." Margaret studied her for a moment. "You could have walked away after they judged you." Naomi gently straightened a stack of dessert plates. "Maybe, but the contract wasn't the only thing at risk tonight." "What do you mean?" Naomi looked toward the private dining room, where voices had grown noticeably quieter. "If people lose faith in each other because no one speaks when something is wrong, everybody pays for that eventually." Margaret smiled with quiet admiration before returning to her duties. A few minutes later, Ethan stepped into the service hallway alone. No attorneys, no investors, no assistants following behind him. For the first time that evening, he entered a space normally, occupied by cooks, dishwashers, servers, and maintenance workers instead of executives. The polished leather shoes that had crossed boardrooms around the country now stood on the same tiled floor Naomi walked every day. He found her carefully arranging coffee cups onto a rolling cart. She looked up, surprised but composed. Neither of them spoke immediately. The noise from the kitchen continued around them, completely unaware that something much larger than a business agreement had changed. Ethan held the folded resume in one hand, but made no attempt to show it to her. Instead, he quietly asked the question he should have asked from the very beginning. "Naomi, would you tell me the story I never bothered to see?" Naomi looked at Ethan for a long moment before setting the final coffee cup onto the cart. Around them, the evening shift continued with its ordinary rhythm. Plates disappeared into the kitchen. Fresh linens arrived from the laundry room. Someone laughed softly near the pastry station. The world had not stopped simply because 2 strangers were finally seeing each other clearly. "There's not much of a story," Naomi said quietly. Ethan gave a small shake of his head. "I don't believe that anymore." She rested both hands lightly against the handle of the cart. "I finished graduate school believing hard work would be enough. I accepted internships, stayed late, asked questions, learned from everyone willing to teach me. Then my mother became sick. Her voice remained steady, free from bitterness. She raised me alone. Walking away wasn't an option. Ethan listened without interrupting. For almost 3 years, every plan I had became secondary. Hospital visits replaced interviews. Medical bills replaced savings. By the time she was gone, the companies that once wanted to hire me had already filled their positions. Every interview after that ended the same way. They looked at the gap on my resume before they looked at me. She smiled faintly. Eventually, the Ashford Grand offered me honest work. It paid the rent. It gave me health insurance. It gave me dignity. That was enough. Ethan glanced down at the folded resume still resting in his hand. It shouldn't have been all you were given. Naomi answered gently. Life isn't always fair, but people still choose how they respond to it. The words landed with surprising weight. Ethan realized she was not talking about her career anymore. She was talking about him. He drew a slow breath. Naomi, I owe you an apology. She remained silent, allowing him to continue. When you walked into that dining room, I decided who you were before you spoke a single sentence. I saw a uniform instead of a person. I saw a job title instead of intelligence. Then, when you tried to help me, my first instinct was to question your place instead of your warning. His voice softened. You saved my company from a mistake that could have followed us for years, and I nearly asked security to escort you out. Naomi studied his face. The confidence that had defined him all evening had been replaced by something far more difficult. Humility. Thank you for saying that, she replied. Most people never do. Ethan looked directly at her. I'd like to correct what I can. Before Naomi could respond, the general manager entered the hallway with several executives standing behind him. The senior legal counsel stepped forward first. Miss Brooks, he said respectfully, our review confirmed your interpretation completely. If you hadn't spoken when you did, the agreement would have exposed Caldwell Dynamics to liabilities exceeding $200 million. Several investors exchanged quiet glances, still struggling to accept how close they had come to signing the document. Ethan turned toward them before looking back at Naomi. Everyone in that room deserves to hear something. He motioned toward the private dining room. Naomi hesitated for only a moment before following him inside. The same executives who had watched her carry dinner plates now stood as she entered. No one spoke. Ethan walked to the head of the table where the unsigned agreement still rested beneath the chandelier. He looked around the room before saying calmly, Tonight, I made the worst leadership mistake of my career. I judged someone's value by the uniform she wore instead of the character and wisdom she carried. Naomi Brooks didn't save this company because of her education alone. She saved it because she refused to stay silent when doing the right thing mattered more than protecting herself. From this moment forward, I expect everyone in this company, including me, to remember that respect belongs to people before it belongs to titles. Then Ethan reached into his jacket, removed his executive access card, placed it gently beside the unsigned contract, and turned to Naomi with one unexpected request that left the entire room holding its breath. The room remained completely still as Ethan's executive access card rested beside the unsigned agreement. Every person present understood the symbolism. It represented authority, influence, and years of achievement. Yet he had placed it on the table as though admitting that none of those things mattered if judgment came before understanding. He looked directly at Naomi and spoke with a sincerity no prepared speech could imitate. Would you help my leadership team review every major agreement before we sign it? A quiet murmur spread across the room. Naomi seemed genuinely surprised. She glanced briefly at the familiar navy blue uniform she was still wearing before meeting Ethan's eyes again. I appreciate your confidence, but I don't think that's what tonight was about. Ethan waited for her to continue. If I accept because everyone suddenly knows my resume, then we're repeating the same mistake in reverse. People shouldn't be valued only after someone discovers an impressive credential. Respect shouldn't require proof. Her words settled over the room with a different kind of silence, one that invited reflection instead of discomfort. Several executives slowly lowered their eyes. The senior legal counsel nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing a lesson that extended far beyond corporate law. Ethan smiled for the first time that evening, not because he had won an argument, but because he realized Naomi was teaching one final lesson. Then tell me what tonight should be about, he said quietly. Naomi looked around the room at the faces that had watched her serve dinner only an hour earlier. It should be about remembering. That every person you meet has a story you probably haven't earned the right to judge. Some wear suits. Some wear uniforms. Neither tells you what they had to overcome before walking into the room. No one interrupted. Even the hotel staff, standing near the entrance, listened in respectful silence. Ethan slowly picked up his access card again before turning toward the general manager of the Ashford Grand. Tomorrow morning, I'd like to invite Miss Brooks to visit our headquarters. Not for an interview, not as a favor, as a professional conversation, if she chooses. Naomi smiled warmly. I'd be happy to have the conversation. The general manager smiled as well, though he looked more proud than surprised. The unsigned merger agreement was carefully collected by the attorneys for revision, while investors quietly discussed how narrowly disaster had been avoided. Yet the document no longer felt like the most important thing that had happened that night. As the meeting finally ended, executives thanked hotel employees by name as they walked toward the elevators. Several paused to shake hands with cooks, servers, and maintenance staff they had barely noticed before entering the building. Ethan remained behind for a moment. Near the dining room entrance, he noticed the small embroidered name tag he had pulled from Naomi's uniform earlier in the evening. Someone had placed it neatly on a side table after finding it on the floor. He picked it up carefully, walked over to Naomi, and without saying a word, held it out to her with both hands. She accepted it with a gentle smile. "Thank you," she said simply. "No," Ethan replied softly. "Thank you." The following morning, sunlight poured through the glass walls of Caldwell Dynamics as employees arrived carrying laptops and coffee cups, unaware that one decision made the night before had already begun changing their company's culture. Weeks later, a new leadership initiative appeared throughout every office. It carried no photograph and mentioned no names. The message was short enough to fit on a single page, but powerful enough to reshape countless conversations. It read, "See the person before the position. Listen before you assume." Character is never determined by a uniform. Months later, visitors occasionally noticed a framed navy blue hotel name tag displayed quietly inside Ethan's office beside awards, patents, and business honors. When they asked why something so ordinary occupied such an important place, he would simply smile and say that it reminded him of the most valuable lesson he had ever learned. That true leadership begins the moment you stop measuring people by what they wear and start recognizing the quiet strength they carry where no title can ever reach.